Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
From an historic celebration in Washington to crisis in California, the state's leadership in the national health care debate, the impact of double-digit unemployment and the credit crunch, controversy over California's water policy, effects of the federal stimulus, and panic over swine flu. The year in review coming up next. Good evening, I'm Belva Davis. Welcome to This Week in Northern California. What a way to end the first decade of the 21st century. For many of us, 2009 has been a year of few highs and many lows. Tonight, I look back at California's massive budget crisis, the state's political landscape, the recession, and California as an epicenter of foreclosures and sky-high unemployment. The perspective from the ethnic media on stimulus spending and the H1N1 response, and some controversial environment stories. Joining me are John Myers, Sacramento Bureau Chief for KQED Public Radio from Sacramento, and Carla Marinucci, political reporter with the San Francisco Chronicle. Tom Vacar, consumer editor with KTVU News. Odette Keeley, reporter for New America Media. And Paul Rogers, environment writer with the San Jose Mercury News. John Myers, we just have to start this conversation with you and the struggles in California this year, and it starts with budget deficit.
Yeah, I think you're right, Belva. I mean, you know, when you look at what's happened in California, and you look at the story of this economy, of this recession, you can see it most plainly in what happens in state government and the money that gets spent by the state and gets transferred out to local areas. Think about it, you know, every year here at the state capitol, the budget process is the most contentious and it's the most exhausting part of what I think lawmakers and the governor do. And this year, I mean, we've really had budget fatigue. We had a $42 billion budget problem in February, a $25 billion budget problem in July, and now we're hearing about another $21 billion budget problem. That's $88 billion of budget red ink, and that's really, you know, what the state has taken in a year in these bad times. And so the problems have gone from bad to worse. The solutions have gone from bad to worse. I don't think anyone would doubt that there have been real reductions in spending across lots of places you can feel, education, social services for the poor. But there also have been a lot of those gimmicks that we've seen from time gone past. And I think the real question is, what do we do now? I mean, you know, all the, not even the easy solutions, the hard solutions have already been done. And I don't think anybody knows where we go from here.
Well, I think that's what we've been hearing from Sacramento all year, and particularly from our governor. You know, people around this table, I can think of one.
Yeah, John,
was
I mean,
unmanageable.
Governor Schwarzenegger, this is the dominant political figure in so many ways in California over the last decade. He's got the central role here. Tell us what you think his legacy is coming out of this decade and at the end of his term here. I mean, how is the last year? How does he recover? What's his legacy going into this whole thing?
Yeah, I don't see how you can say Arnold Schwarzenegger's legacy is not the state's finances and the state budget. I mean, I think that's got to be front and center. I mean, let's not forget Arnold Schwarzenegger is at the center of what I think was really the story of the decade, which was the recall of 2003, the political story in California of the decade. And that recall campaign was all about the state's budget and stopping the crazy deficit spending, tearing up the credit cards, and yet we still have these problems. Some of this is from the recession, but a fair amount of this is really systemic, and I don't see that the governor has found a solution to this. Maybe some people would say he hasn't looked hard enough. Some people say he hasn't taken the hard choices. He hasn't made Californians really think about the real spending cuts and real tax increases that are needed. But, the state's financial problems were here before him. They're going to be here after him. And I'm not sure that history is going to judge him too well on that. I mean, I know he wants to talk about global warming issues. He wants to talk about government reform. But if you can't fix the state's finances, and that's what he got elected on, it's hard to see that's not the legacy.
John, sorry, Tom. I have to ask you about the California budget and how it relates to the stimulus. Hispanic media, La Opinion, based in Los Angeles, reported that as of August, the California coffers had been filled up with the biggest stimulus funding than any other state, 11.4 billion. But there were also concerns of threats that because of deep budget cuts, the state might lose some of these federal match funds. Did we lose any of those funds from the stimulus?
We haven't yet, but that's a great point, I think, as we go forward and figure out what happens now that we're coming out of the end of this very hard year, because that $21 billion that I talked about that the lawmakers are going to be faced with in the new year, in 2010, one of the reasons it's going to be so hard to solve that problem is that a fair amount, a large amount, more than half, I actually should say, of the state's budget is tied up in education spending and health care for low-income folks. Those dollars are attached to stimulus dollars, and the stimulus rules say that we cannot cut those any lower if we don't want to lose some of those billions of dollars of stimulus funding. So there's more than half of the places that you could look to trim funding that you can't touch if you want to keep that stimulus money. No one wants to lose that stimulus money. I think, one of the fascinating things is how much that money has gone to really plug the holes in the state budget. I mean, people think that things in the schools, for example, have been bad. They would be a lot worse if there was not some of that stimulus money for education. So it's going to be really interesting to watch how you keep that money, but also solve the problem.
But you get the impression, at least I get the impression from having been up there quite a few times, that these guys still don't get it. It's still about ideology. It's still about my way or the highway, that they're really not interested personally in getting this thing resolved, that it's a battle of ideologies rather than it is doing what they were elected to do.
Yeah, I think that's true, Tom. I mean, one of the things we certainly know, we've talked about so many times in these conversations, is the partisan paralysis of the Capitol. Republicans on one side don't want to move on things like taxes, for example. Democrats on one side, they don't want to move on cuts, but to a certain level. And again, I think this comes back to the legacy of Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's never found a way to bridge the gap. Some people would say he's never had the relationship with the legislature he needed to have. I think he's one of several, we've had several governors in California who've kind of looked at the legislature as they're there to implement my vision. I think that was the famous line from Gray Davis. I don't think Arnold Schwarzenegger's found a way to work with these legislators either. And I think that's why a lot of people are talking about government reform. They're talking about redistricting reform, drawing political maps. They're talking about the open primary in June of next year. Something to try to break this logjam where people can stop looking at the parties and start trying to find some kind of common ground.
Well, John, you're talking about leadership show, so we're going to move over to Carla right now, because we started off talking about the celebration of the Obama administration. So some of the same kinds of charges about leadership might apply here. How are voters feeling about it now?
Absolutely right, Belvin. When you think about the change in less than a year, it was hope and change in January. It just descended into disillusionment and anger. If you look back at this year, I think you'd have to say it's the year of the angry voter. Whether you talk about the Tea Parties on the right or you talk about Code Pink on the left, both ends of the political spectrum have worries and concerns and anger about the way things have come down, both in Washington and in Sacramento this year. I mean, there were a lot of changes that we saw on the political landscape. We close out the year with Californians being upset, angry about the economy. That's their number one issue. And upset about political leadership. They're looking at the governor's race going ahead. Most of them don't like a lot of the candidates they're seeing. In the Republican race, you've seen the rise of wealthy candidates and women candidates. Meg Whitman, former CEO of eBay, a billionaire, has never run for political offices, running for governor. And despite all the money she spent so far and put $19 million in, 44% of the people still don't know who she is. Voters are not focused on this, and that's what this is a theme we have seen all year. They're worried about other issues. So the women candidates is one thing, Whitman and Fiorina, I think, and all the way down the ticket in California, we're seeing women coming up, running for some of these statewide offices. I think that's important. And on the Democratic side, I got to mention Jerry Brown, who has cleared the field. Someone who has been governor decades ago. And that's going to be, I think, that is another sort of story of the year that we saw, and it has yet to be played out.
It's interesting, though. Voters are angry, but they're not angry at Obama in California. A PPIC poll out this week, Obama had 60% approval rating.
Right.
He was elected nationally with 53%, so he's much more popular here than he is in the rest of the country.
Although I will say, Paul, I will say on that,
Yeah.
generally you're right. They're happy with Obama. They're concerned on issues like health care, climate
Sure.
change, and we'll talk about that.
He remains, but it's interesting, you hear people quite often saying, especially in the Bay Area, Obama hasn't done anything, right? That was the old Saturday Night Live joke. And it's interesting because maybe some of these stories will manifest on the one-year anniversary in January, but he saved the banks. He raised the minimum wage for the first time in 10 years. He got the first Latina woman ever confirmed to the Supreme Court. He saved 2 million acres of wilderness. He increased gasoline mileage standards in automobiles.
No,
He's got health care bills further than any president since Roosevelt.
But let's remember
so
that
where is that coming from?
at the
Is that
same
angry
time,
liberals who thought that the world was all going to change the day you took
I think
office?
we have to say that the Republicans have been very, very effective, both nationally and in California.
But this is the left saying that.
In creating, and on the left, you've got concerns about Afghanistan and expenditures there. So from both ends of the spectrum, Obama is getting heat. And the independents who went with him are starting to disintegrate. That's some of the concerns we're seeing there. And you got to say, on issues like health care, let's just take that issue. An issue where California has led the way in a lot of ways with the Healthy Families Program, and San Francisco has led the way, being the first city to offer universal health care. And yet, we're seeing, as we speak, the Senate hashing this out, and we don't know how that one is going to end up.
John Myers
Carla,
has a question for
well,
you.
yeah, Carla, I was going to say, you mentioned at the beginning, you talked about, the year of the angry voter, and I think you're absolutely right. I'm curious what you think that means for state politics in 2010. We've got a governor's race you talked about, a Senate race. We've got all these ballot measures. And we've got this big feel for government reform. I mean, what happens to angry voters when they see all of these things out there that, are they going to buy any of it?
I think you got a really good point, John. This is going to go to the leading race in this state, the governor's race. Does Jerry Brown run as a reformer, or does he run as somebody who is experienced and knows how to handle the problems? It doesn't look like voters are interested in people who are experienced anymore. The legislature, as you know, approval rating down to 17%. Voters are very much in an anti-incumbent mood. So I think Brown can absolutely make the case that he has been a reformer for much of his career, and I think that's the theme you'll see him use going forward. But your constitutional convention, the 2/3 budget vote, these are all things that are going to matter to people, I think, going forward. They want some kind of change, and their elected officials to do something up
And
there.
mostly they want the recession to end. So Tom Vacar, 209, has been called the year of the Great Recession. Locally, what are the biggest scars of the economic crisis?
Well, unemployment is by far the biggest scar. Certainly the decline in housing values is another major scar, but that is made even worse by unemployment. California, as one of the top unemployed states in the nation, is by far the most important economics engine of the 50 engines that we have called the United States. And we're in the worst situation we've been employment-wise since post-World War II. The state budget only makes that worse because that really exacerbates the unemployment situation to the nth degree. As I said, housing is one of those things that in fits and starts tries to get better and then doesn't get better. That all against this other background, which is truly remarkable, of most of the leading economic indicators, both here in California and around the country, saying that things really are getting better, but so far very much a jobless recovery. So California is probably going to be a while dragging itself out of that. In fact, UCLA did a study, and they believe that this will be a sluggish recovery in California all the way through 2010. So the legacy of, and the lesson, I guess, of 2009 was that we have a bit of a train wreck here in the state of California. But again, having said that, the major stock markets in this country, compared to March, just 9 months ago, compared to that, they're up 60 to 70%. So there's a lot of good stuff on the horizon. The question really becomes, how does California capitalize on that? And that's going to have to do a heck of a lot with what happens in the rest of the world and the rest of the nation.
And Tom, what did we learn from the last year in terms of the jobless rate here in California? We're seeing a shift, away from heavy industry. and the high tech sector is continually important. But are they going to be able to bounce back? What have we seen in terms of how they've been affected?
Well, the big question is what jobs are actually going to return. We know, for example, that retailing is changing very rapidly. So those jobs that, for example, were always there during the holidays aren't there anymore because so much of that has gone to the internet. Take the U.S. Postal Service as another example. They are down over the last 3 years. The U.S. Postal Service, one of the most labor-intensive organizations on the planet Earth, down 27% in volume. Last year alone, 25 billion pieces less mail. So yeah.
So did the stimulus funds help us in the jobs over the last year, as the
all
Obama administration said that?
All the stimulus dollars did in California seems to have been to keep a hemorrhage from becoming much greater. But did it create a lot of new jobs? No, it did not. And we see that by the numbers that we're looking at, 12.5%. And we're going to certainly be in the double digits all the way through 2010.
Tom, for African American media, they could not overstress the fact that unemployment was their biggest concern. They even cited that 1 out of 3 young African American males out of jobs. This almost eerily matched the Great Depression numbers. You had CBC, Congresswoman Waters, using the joblessness of African Americans to rebuke President Obama by killing the vote on financial regulation reform. Do you think these moves in Washington and in the local level can help California officials trying to solve the joblessness for blacks?
Well, for anybody, and because of the historical problems in the African American community, there's a lot of lack of education, a lot of lack of opportunity. Education is the key to surviving in the next 10 years to 20 years. If you don't get educated, if you don't get a skill, if you don't do something, you can no longer depend on those jobs that don't require skill. Even people that install solar panels think, well, they're just slapping that on the roof. No, they're not. This is a technical job compared to many other jobs.
The best example, look at the NUMMI plant that's closing in the Bay Area. That's 4,000 or 5,000 jobs, right?
The West, and California in particular, has always been somewhat hostile towards manufacturing. We've always kind of thought of ourselves as something bigger and better than that. And it's very difficult to do business as a manufacturer here in California. But the question is, what entrepreneurial things are going to come to take the place of that? And we know that after the last 4 recessions in this state, there were new jobs. Things like webmasters, things like software engineers. All that stuff came into being. The question is, what is the next wave going to be? If that next wave doesn't show up, and soon, and it may be green technology, California may spend the next decade, not the next year, the next decade, floundering, trying to figure out what it wants to be.
Tom, I'm just wondering. I just wonder if as bad as we say things are in California, there's some people who say we still have a pretty good shot at things, and they point to venture capital money that still by and large comes to California. I mean, don't we still have some silver linings there in some ways?
The greatest silver lining that California has, better than any other place on planet Earth, is the fact that we have entrepreneurs in this state. Believe it or not, in one of the worst quarters of last year, one of the worst quarters, Californians created 19,000 new companies. It is entrepreneurial spirit in this state that has always saved it, that has saved it from being in a complete and total train wreck. As bad as it is now, it would be much worse. So yes, we have the entrepreneurial spirit. We certainly have the handle on the green economy, although the Chinese are saying that they want to take that thing over. But the reality of the situation is we are in the best position to recover. We just haven't recovered yet.
Tom, I really thank you for finding that silver lining for us. Well, Odette, Keeley, you mentioned about the Congressional Black Caucus and jobs and the need for them. What are the major stories that the ethnic press have concentrated on?
What we saw, Belva, in the range of stories in the ethnic media sector, journalists I've spoken to every week on our New America Now radio show, and just coming off of Tom, it really was predominance of economic issues, whether it's African American and Latino media talking about the sharpest reversal in home ownership in decades, or African American and Native American media talking about joblessness. There was also a lot of intersection of issues. We mentioned about H1N1 response. It was curious that with the H1N1 flu vaccine issue or concern, plus even the 2010 census count, a lot of immigration reform issues intersected with that. You had immigrants thinking about, when I go to the clinic, when I go to the hospital, are they going to ask about my status? Am I going to be disclosed to immigration officials? And am I going to be deported? But I do want to focus on 2 just really compelling reports. What the ethnic media is best at is really just the personal, the invisible behind the headlines. And starting with the African American media, it was all about the stimulus. The Sacramento Observer, an African American publication and website, had this headline for many weeks: where is the stimulus? Out of the $787 billion funds that were in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, all these promises by the president and the government were, for a lot of it, was going to go to ethnic groups and African Americans in particular. He laid out a 100 projects list where there were all these investments that he said, it's going to go to your community: green jobs, schools, education, healthcare. But African American leaders and advocates are like wondering, where is it? They're not feeling it on the ground. They don't see it in concrete terms. African American businesses and contractors are saying, we're not getting those contracts, we're not getting those businesses. And there's some development and follow-up to that. The second one is how immigration health really became illuminated. We talk about in the news about the big picture of immigration reform and the frustrations around it and the complexity of that law, but for Hispanic media, you had La Opinión, the biggest Spanish language daily in Los Angeles, talking about the story of Mexicans coming home to die because they had contracted AIDS. And it illuminates so much of what it is about the immigration healthcare system and immigration and healthcare systems and how broken they are, and even the Mexican healthcare system. You had this mother who welcomed home her daughter after many, many years, hoping for a joyful reunion, but she came home skin and bones, the grandchildren were disheveled because she had contracted AIDS and didn't get help in time. And they come home to Mexico where there is very inadequate health care. So this is a very heartbreaking story. They felt they had no recourse but to go home and die.
On the issue of immigration reform, Odette, I think you're right. In tough economic times, we know immigrants are the ones that are often targeted, and you've seen this in the press, the concerns about that. At the same time, we know there's been some changes. Jerry Brown as Attorney General and Obama administration have both started to go after employers that are exploiting immigrant workers. We haven't seen this for years. We didn't see this under Bush. How do you think this is playing out in the press, in the ethnic press, concerns about exploitation, and whether the conservatives are going to keep calling for immigration reform or to get tough on undocumented immigrants? How are the economic issues going to
They see those sides in the ethnic sector, but it's a wide net that's always cast. When these raids happen, when the employers are being investigated, it usually is about the roundup of the undocumented workers that are first put into the jails and deported right after. The biggest hope right now is what happened on December 15. Representative Luis Gutierrez of Illinois filed what he calls the last push for comprehensive immigration reform. So there's a lot of hope around that. The president has said, this won't get onto my table. I can't work on immigration reform until 2010. So at least there's a law now and some improvements around it, especially the DREAM Act. So that's what Hispanic media and ethnic press is waiting for.
He's going to be a pretty busy president in 2010. Well, Paul Rogers, I ask you that in the shadow of Copenhagen, the big environmental stories of this past year.
Well, for Northern California, there have really been three leading environmental stories. The first one, and the one that I think has the largest impact around the country, is climate change, and in particular the fact that President Obama in June granted California the right to set auto emission limits in the state for all the cars sold in California. This is a law that Gray Davis signed. It's called the Pavley Bill. Governor Schwarzenegger supported it. It would require that all autos sold in California by 2016 reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. Now, 13 other states have copied that law, and those states all represent 40% of all the new cars sold in America. So the car makers aren't going to make two different types of cars. The Bush administration was blocking California from allowing that to take effect. So now that the Obama administration has allowed it to take effect, all the new cars sold in America in the next 5 years are going to be dramatically more fuel efficient. Probably instead of getting a fleet average of 25 miles to the gallon, they'll be getting 35 miles to the gallon. Second biggest story in California has been the drought and water. We just finished the third year in a row of drought. We're in the worst drought since 20 years ago, the drought that ended 1991. Luckily, this year appears to be an El Nino year. We're starting with some pretty good rain. Right now, Bay Area cities like San Francisco and San Jose are 110% of the historic norm. So we're running a little bit ahead. We've had some big storms, but the reservoirs are still only about a third full. So we have a lot of depleted funds in our checking account water-wise we need to get up. And finally, the state parks problem in California. As everybody saw, the governor was looking at closing first nearly the entire state park system, and then he reduced it under public pressure to 100, and then at the last minute he said no state parks would close, but he reduced hours all over the place. 80 million Californians rather use, let me rephrase that. There are 80 million visits a year to California state parks. So a lot of Californians go to the beaches, they go to the forest, and environmentalists were so upset by all this that they have begun a ballot initiative for next November to see if people want to charge themselves $18 extra on their DMV registration to double the budget of the state parks. And we'll be interested to see if that passes or not.
Well, on the issue of climate change, we've seen 2009, wasn't it a year in which there was ground lost in public opinion? The conservatives have been very effective on that. We've even seen a Republican candidate here, Mick Whitman, ask for a rollback of AB 32. Do you think that's going to, is that how you see it? I mean, was this significant?
Yes, I mean, the polls are showing that not as many people care about climate change or believe that the Earth is warming. The scientific evidence that the Earth is warming is overwhelming, and people are in the worst economy since the Great Depression. When you tell them that this is going to raise your gas prices, this is going to raise your PG&E bill, they get scared. But the interesting thing on climate change, I believe, and you're not going to hear this from the Obama administration as clearly, though, is the political battle is over. The Supreme Court 2 years ago ruled that the U.S. EPA could regulate greenhouse gases. Once that was clear, the game was over. It doesn't matter whether Congress passes a bill or not, because Obama has started the EPA down the road where it's going to limit the amount of carbon dioxide that comes out of factories. It will fine them just like any other pollutant. As I mentioned, he's already moved ahead with the autos. The administration is going to reduce CO2, whether or not Congress acts, regardless of what happens in Copenhagen. That battle's over.
Let me ask you
Paul,
this.
I wanted to ask you about water because, I mean, obviously it was a big water issue here at the state capitol. We all saw the legislation to deal with the water system in California. $11 billion bond on the ballot next year, talk of a peripheral canal around the Delta again, you know, more ways to kind of deal with sustainability and reliability of water. I mean, what do you see as that? Was that package enough? Was it substantial? I mean, is it going to live up to the hype?
It was a lot of hype, and in the end, there's not a lot substantial there. Governor Schwarzenegger is saying that this is going to be a big part of his legacy, but the $11 billion bond act that's on the November ballot, there's $3 billion in there for dams, there's a lot of other projects. There's a lot of pork in there, and the poll out the other day had it at 43%. So, you know, that may not pass.
Let me ask you this.
Next time.
Okay.
This was a swift half hour. Well, much more to talk about. My thanks to all of you, Paul, Tom, and to Carla, and to Odette for being with us. And you too, John, from up there in Sacramento. Well, be sure to visit our website at kqed.org/thisweek. Answer my question of the week. What do you believe are the most pressing issues facing California in 2010? You can also watch complete episodes and segments. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can subscribe to our podcast and comment on the show. Tune in on Friday, January the 8th, for a conversation with San Francisco District Attorney Kamala Harris. We wish you a safe and happy holiday season and a happy new year. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.